There is a very easy way to describe a Christopher Nolan film because usually time is doing something weird. A serious man is carrying a dead wife in his head, and somebody is explaining a complicated rule while the soundtrack tries to destroy the theater's foundations. Then, just when you think the film might finally answer the question it spent 3 hours putting in your head, the ending cuts away 1 second before the internet can agree on what happened. I don't think that description is wrong, by the way. I just think it keeps us staring at the machinery when the more interesting question is why Nolan keeps building this particular machinery again and again. But after putting Nolan's films next to decades of his interviews, I started feeling that time is not really his subject, or at least not the complete subject, because time is more like the tool he keeps picking up whenever he wants to reach something much more ordinary. The deeper subject is something more ordinary and honestly more uncomfortable. How does a limited human being decide what is real, who they are, and what they are responsible for? Nolan has described himself as fascinated by subjective experience. All of us occupy one perspective while agreeing that an objective world exists outside it. Cinema, for him, is a machine that lets many people temporarily occupy the same point of view, and that idea is already visible in Following and Memento. The same idea grows into dreams in Inception, relativity in Interstellar, survival in Dunkirk, history in Oppenheimer, and eventually myth in the Odyssey, where the scale has become enormous, but the person trapped inside one limited point of view is still basically the same. His characters almost never get the whole map, only fragments like a photograph, a diary, a memory, a scientific theory, or somebody else's testimony, and they have to build enough of a reality from those pieces to act, even though the story they create might save them or completely ruin them. Most of the time, it seems to do both, which is why I don't want to diagnose Christopher Nolan through his movies or invent a secret philosophy on his behalf, because Nolan himself is careful about separating a work from its maker, and I think we should be careful too. What we can do is compare what he has repeatedly said with the choices he repeatedly makes, and once we do that, a fairly consistent worldview appears. It begins with a simple problem: reality exists, but we never receive it whole. The first place I noticed, this was in Nolan's first feature, Following. It is about a young writer who trails strangers because he wants access to their lives and he thinks observation will turn other people into knowable stories. Instead, he is manipulated by a man who understands his curiosity better than he does. The film came partly from Nolan's interest in the invasion of personal space after his London flat was burgled, but the more important pattern is already there. The protagonist mistakes information for control. He believes that if he watches closely enough, the world will become legible. What he cannot see is that somebody else is arranging the evidence in front of him, and when I noticed that, Following started looking like a small, rough version of the same machine Nolan would keep rebuilding for the rest of his career. Then Memento turns the machine inward. Leonard Shelby cannot form new long-term memories, but Nolan resisted treating him as a blank person. Leonard knows his name, his past, his wife, and the injury that supposedly defines his life. The question, as Nolan explained in a 2001 Fresh Air interview, is not who could I be? It is who am I now, and how does that relate to who I was? Leonard outsources memory to Polaroids, notes, tattoos, and habits, which looks completely rational at first because in software terms he has moved state out of unreliable memory and into persistent storage, except the person deciding what enters that database is still Leonard. What disturbed me in Memento was not simply that memory is fragile, because we already know that, but that even evidence becomes fragile when the person creating it has a motive. And Leonard is not merely suffering inside this broken system, he is also quietly administering it. At the end, or chronologically, near the beginning, he knowingly creates the clue that will turn Teddy into his next target, and then his condition will convert that choice into unquestionable truth. He becomes both the liar and the person fooled by the lie. Nolan designed the film so the audience experiences the same informational problem. The color scenes run backward, dropping us into situations without the knowledge Leonard lacks. The black and white scenes run forward and initially feel more objective, and the two streams meet, and the structure itself becomes the argument. Perspective controls judgment. Nolan said the plot is actually simple and it becomes complicated because we must assemble it as Leonard does. I think this distinction matters because Nolan is not saying that truth does not exist. Teddy was either telling the truth or he was not. Leonard's wife died in some particular way, and all of these events still happened in a real order even if Leonard cannot access it. Nolan's ambiguity depends on a solid underlying interpretation, and he has said that if a filmmaker has no answer, ambiguity becomes contradictory and the audience feels cheated. The uncertainty comes from aligning us with a character who cannot know. So this is not nothing is real, it is almost the opposite. So the point is not that nothing is real, which would actually be a much easier idea. The point is that reality is real enough to destroy you, even though you're badly equipped to see all of it. In Insomnia, Detective Will Dormer does not have Leonard's neurological condition. He just has guilt, exhaustion, professional incentives, and permanent daylight, which sounds less dramatic until all of them begin working together, and his sense of time, judgment, and even basic perception gradually start collapsing into each other. His moral certainty slowly goes with it, and Nolan said he wanted the audience floating by the end, unsure how much time had passed or whether we had the whole picture, which made the connection click for me. Leonard cannot retain the truth, while Dormer cannot tolerate it. Both men build a practical system around a private wound and tell themselves it exists to serve justice, though the longer we watch them operate it, the harder it becomes to ignore that the system is also protecting them from something they do not want to admit. This is the first block in Nolan's worldview. Human beings do not simply observe reality, and we edit it into something survivable. This is where the idea became more interesting to me. Because once reality has been filtered through a person's perspective, identity also starts becoming unstable, not because the self is fake, but because maintaining any version of the self takes a surprising amount of construction. Nolan's Batman trilogy makes that construction literal. Bruce Wayne is not an alien and does not have a magical inheritance. He studies, trains, designs a symbol, sources equipment, tests it, fails, and iterates. Nolan has said he is fascinated by the process of becoming an ordinary person, methodically turning himself into a larger-than-life figure. Once the film begins explaining how One Piece works, he believes it has to follow the logic all the way, rather than hide behind an improbable jump. That is why Batman Begins sometimes feels like a startup origin story with childhood trauma attached, because we watch Bruce prototype the armor, solve mobility and manufacturing problems, establish operational security, and somewhere between all of that work out what Batman is supposed to mean to Gotham. But the engineering is not the point by itself. Bruce builds Batman because a person is limited and a symbol can outlive the person. At the end of The Dark Knight Rises, the identity becomes transferable. Nolan's stated interpretation is explicit. Batman is a symbol and can be anybody. This sounds optimistic until we get to The Prestige, because Borden also builds an identity bigger than one man, only here the construction is much uglier. His perfect trick depends on two brothers giving up half a biography each and alternating between lover, father, magician, and prisoner. Nolan once summarized a central truth behind the performance. We are different people to the different people in our lives. Angier chooses the opposite solution, and he wants the audience's love attached to his name. When Tesla's machine duplicates him, every performance produces two equally valid Angiers, and one must die so the other can receive the applause. He cannot know whether he will be the man in The Prestige or the man drowning below the stage. In both cases, identity becomes a production system with a horrifying maintenance cost. The film itself behaves like a magic trick. Nolan did not think recorded stage magic could impress an audience that knows cameras can lie, so he shaped the movie according to the principles of an illusion. The form misdirects us while openly explaining misdirection, and we are not fooled because information is absent. We are fooled because the story gives us a more comfortable place to look. This is what connects Borden and Angier back to Leonard, because each of them chooses one story that can organize his life and then slowly sacrifices reality to keep it stable. Whether that story is revenge, becoming a symbol, being a great magician, or simply getting home. The identity creates purpose, and then purpose starts demanding sacrifices. Nolan's protagonists are often described as cold, but compartmentalized feels more accurate to me, because the emotion is very much there. It has simply been converted into a project where grief can look like revenge, fear can look like Batman, and guilt can look like an entire dream architecture. Eventually, intellectual ambition becomes a bomb, and this is where the pattern started making emotional sense to me, because building is often how these characters avoid sitting still with whatever happened to them before the movie began. Nolan clearly understands the appeal of this because his films love process, teams, tools, rules, diagrams, rehearsals, and specialists who are extremely good at one narrow job, and watching all of that competence move toward a solution feels like progress even when the goal itself is quietly becoming dangerous. But here's the catch. A perfectly executed system can still be pointed at the wrong goal. What I kept noticing is that Nolan's cinema respects obsession because obsession makes difficult things possible. It also fears obsession because the obsessed person can rename every cost as commitment. The Prestige is probably the cleanest example because Borden understands that great craft requires total commitment, while Angier understands that craft alone means very little if an audience cannot feel its effect. And the tragedy is that both men take one useful truth and turn it into an absolute. Angier understands that the audience does not reward a sacrifice it cannot see, it rewards wonder. And together these two men managed to produce something genuinely great while slowly erasing almost every ordinary thing that might have made the achievement worth having. There is a tempting autobiographical reading here, the controlling filmmaker, the practical effects, the secrecy, the showman asking whether we are watching closely. Some of it is fair as interpretation. Nolan himself acknowledged that Inception drifted toward the filmmaking process, even though he did not consciously design every one-to-one analogy. But turning every obsessive Nolan protagonist into Nolan himself is lazy, and it replaces analysis with a personality theory we cannot prove. The more defensible claim is that Nolan repeatedly uses obsession as a moral stress test. Can you remain good while pursuing a goal that rewards bad behavior? Batman faces the same question politically when he builds a citywide sonar system from people's phones to find the Joker, and Lucius Fox immediately calls it unethical. But the uncomfortable part is that the machine works because Nolan is rarely interested in tempting a character with something useless. His dangerous tools solve the immediate problem. The Joker also tells partial truths. Nolan and his co-writers decided that the most threatening villains sincerely believe a coherent view of the world. Ra's al Ghul identifies real corruption, Bane identifies real inequality, and the Joker correctly sees the hypocrisy inside Gotham's public order. The uncomfortable thing is that their diagnosis usually contains some truth, but their method turns actual people into material that can be sacrificed to prove the diagnosis correct. Batman's rule against killing is therefore not a decorative superhero trait. Nolan has called it the backbone of the trilogy. How do you fight somebody willing to do anything when you refuse to become as bad as they are? The answer is not clean. Batman lies about Harvey Dent, uses mass surveillance, operates outside democratic authority, and absorbs blame to protect a civic myth, and he wins tactically while contaminating the system he wants to save. I don't think Nolan is arguing that moral rules make action easy, because in these films, the rule only starts meaning something when breaking it would be genuinely effective, and the character has a very practical reason to pretend that this one exception does not count. This is why his protagonists need some kind of stopping condition, whether it is a line they refuse to cross, a person who can still challenge them, or simply a point where the project must end, because without one, their intelligence only helps them move faster in the same direction. Angier has no stopping condition, Leonard deletes his, Oppenheimer discovers his after the device exists, Odysseus spends a decade learning that victory did not end the war inside him. And Cobb's stopping condition is hidden in one small gesture. At the end of Inception, he stops watching the top. This became clearest to me with Inception, a film people often discuss like an engineering diagram by asking how many layers there are, whose dream we are inside, what every kick does, and obviously whether the top is going to fall after the screen cuts away. Nolan certainly built the rules carefully, but while writing, he realized the heist structure was glamorous and emotionally shallow. A dream story needed an emotional narrative representing somebody's mind, so the mission and Cobb's private journey had to become the same mechanism, and it took him years to solve that. Cobb is not really trapped because the dream rules are too complicated. He is trapped because his guilt has learned how to use every one of those rules better than he has. Mal appears as a hostile projection, but she is made from Cobb and knows his doubts because they are her raw material. So the final confrontation is less a hero facing a villain and more a man confronting the version of love he preserved by refusing to let it change. He cannot bring Mal back, so instead he keeps a perfect and increasingly destructive model of her, and once I saw that connection, Inception stopped looking like a complicated dream manual and started looking like another Nolan film where an emotion has been converted into a system. The spinning top is a clever object because it invites our analytical attention, but Nolan has said the most important emotional fact is that Cobb is no longer looking at it. Whether the world is dream or reality matters less to Cobb than his decision to participate in it. Nolan does have his own concrete answer and believes sincere ambiguity requires one, but he refuses to hand that answer to us because doing so would replace the experience of uncertainty with a small piece of trivia about what the director intended. This is not an escape from truth. Cobb has spent the entire film trying to control experience. In the last moment, he accepts that a life cannot be lived while constantly checking whether it meets an impossible standard of certainty. That leap leads into Interstellar, perhaps Nolan's most openly emotional film. The hard constraint in Interstellar Interstellar is not another invented dream rule but relativity, and Nolan worked with physicist Kip Thorne to follow scientific constraints toward their most extreme dramatic consequences, where a few hours near Gargantua become decades on Earth and time stops being a clever way to organize the plot. It takes children away from their father. Nolan has connected his recurring interest in time to aging. Children grow, things slip away, and time seems to accelerate in middle age. Interstellar converts that feeling into physics. Cooper does not miss his children's lives because he worked late, and he loses them because space-time itself has a different schedule. Then, the film makes its riskiest move. Brand argues that love may have significance beyond dimensions we can measure. Nolan admitted the speech frightened him, and that his earlier genres had allowed him to sidestep exposed emotion, and he kept it because the emotional proposition was central. This is often reduced to love is a magical force, but the film's mechanism is more grounded than that. Love does not calculate the quantum data, and it tells Cooper where to direct attention. It is a form of orientation when the full map is unavailable. That is a recurring Nolan idea. Knowledge is incomplete, but action cannot wait for completeness, so what do you trust? Leonard trusts a system and eventually corrupts it. Bruce trusts a moral rule and repeatedly strains it, while Cobb and Cooper allow an emotional attachment to guide them through something they cannot fully understand, which means none of these characters receives the comfort of certainty before acting. This is probably why the films can feel extremely intellectual without the ideas being their final destination, because the characters need models to move through the world, but at some point, a model stops being useful and cannot tell them what is actually worth saving. This is also why I don't think time is the real subject. Nolan calls time the most cinematic of subjects. Before the movie camera, he points out, human beings could not literally watch motion backward, slowed, or accelerated. Cinema already records time, cuts it, rearranges it, and projects it again. So Nolan is not really placing a puzzle on top of the medium when he manipulates chronology. He is using something movies naturally do and applying it to a different human problem each time. In Memento, Leonard cannot heal because time no longer creates any distance from the wound, while Inception stretches a few real-world seconds into entire subjective lives and uses that expansion to show how deeply a person can disappear inside an unresolved emotion. Interstellar moves the same idea into a family where love remains recognizable after the chronology those people once shared has broken apart, and Dunkirk turns time into the immediate pressure of survival by braiding 1 week on land, 1 day at sea, and 1 hour in the air. Then Tenet makes time part of agency and consequence, allowing cause and effect to travel in both directions while refusing to let the people moving through that loop escape responsibility for what they still have to choose and perform. By the time Nolan reaches Oppenheimer, time has become judgment itself, because the achievement happens first and the understanding arrives much later, when there is no longer any practical way to separate the person who solved the problem from the world that solution created. The cleverness is visible, so it is easy to mistake the structure for the subject. Nolan's own comments point the other way. He studied English literature and wondered why film should not use narrative freedoms that novelists had used for centuries. Nonlinearity is not there to make a simple story look intelligent, and it aligns the viewer with how a character experiences an event. Dunkirk proves this by removing most conventional backstory and asking what a soldier stranded on that beach would actually know, which turns out to be very little. The enemy remains mostly unseen. There is no strategic map to explain the war, and many characters do not even have names. The camera avoids God shots and stays on the beach, in the cockpit, or on the boat. Historical omniscience would reduce the experience, and we know the evacuation's outcome, and the character does not know whether a boat is coming. The 3 timelines also solve an emotional problem. A Spitfire has limited fuel, so an hour can contain a complete arc of sacrifice. A civilian boat needs a day to cross the channel. A stranded soldier endures a week. Clock time differs, but tension allows the film to make these experiences feel simultaneous. Nolan described Dunkirk as a survival film rather than a war film, and rejected a clean patriotic myth in favor of the event's messy historical truth, where the victory is still a retreat and heroism can involve waiting, fleeing, rescuing somebody, enduring fear, or simply failing less badly. Germany is not even the only enemy the characters experience, because most of their immediate problems are exposure, water, fuel, distance, panic, incomplete information, and the rapidly closing window in which rescue might still be possible. Then Tenet takes the old image of a bullet returning to a wall, an image Nolan had already used metaphorically in Memento, and makes it physical. Entropy can reverse, combatants can move through an event in opposed temporal directions. A person can cooperate with a future version of an action they have not subjectively performed yet. It is Nolan's most elaborate machine, and for many viewers, his least emotionally accessible film, which is a criticism worth taking seriously because information density can eventually become cognitive load, and trusting the audience does not automatically mean the interface you built for them cannot be overloaded. But its worldview is consistent, knowing that an event is already in the record does not make choice irrelevant. The protagonist learns that he founded the organization directing him. Neil knows more about their friendship than he does. Their future is somebody else's past, yet both still have to perform the actions that make it true. So when Tenet says, "What's happened happened," I don't read it as simple fatalism. I read it as responsibility without the comforting fantasy that you were never part of the chain, and that same idea becomes impossible to avoid once Nolan reaches Oppenheimer. Nolan has said he is interested in the tension between intention and consequence, how we use them to decide who is heroic and who is villainous. Oppenheimer's life gave him the clearest dramatic example. A scientist helps build a weapon to defeat fascism, then discovers that the technical achievement has reorganized politics, ethics, and human survival. The film does not waste much time asking whether Oppenheimer intended every consequence, because obviously he did not. It asks the harder and more useful question of what responsibility remains after good intentions have stopped explaining the world created by your actions. Nolan adapted American Prometheus, a biography built from decades of research, but he did not present the result as a neutral timeline. He wrote the color sections in first person, even stage directions were written as I to force the screenplay into Oppenheimer's subjective experience. Quantum images, particles, light, and terrible visions are not documentary inserts, and they represent an interpretation of his interior state. The black and white Strauss material initially appears more objective, echoing the color and black and white distinction in Memento, but Strauss has a perspective too. His political resentment rearranges ambiguous events into a story about humiliation. Oppenheimer sees Strauss as part of a machine persecuting him. Strauss sees Oppenheimer as a master manipulator quietly turning history against him. The objective record exists, hearings, dates, testimony, decisions, but history reaches us through people building causal stories from those records. Nolan said he did not want viewers to judge Oppenheimer so much as understand him. That does not mean absolution. Subjectivity brings us close enough to feel the seduction of the problem, the impossible calculation, the urgency of the war, the gathering of brilliant people, the race to make theory physical. The procedural competence is exhilarating because it must have been exhilarating for the people involved, and Nolan lets us feel that excitement properly before the film begins, forcing us to live with what all of that extraordinary competence actually produced. The Trinity sequence refuses immediate moral commentary. Light arrives before sound, and the explosion looks beautiful because physical reality does not adjust its appearance to our ethics, but later, during Oppenheimer's victory speech, stamping feet and cheering faces begin turning into burned bodies inside his perception. He cannot put the consequence back into the machine, and when Nolan later said, "Like it or not, we live in Oppenheimer's world," the line sounded to me like the largest version of a fear running through all his films. Creators eventually lose control of what they create. That applies beyond nuclear weapons. Nolan drew cautious parallels with AI researchers describing their own Oppenheimer moment, particularly around unintended consequences and the responsibility of people introducing powerful technology. He also stressed that AI and nuclear weapons differ materially. Nuclear programs require vast, observable industrial infrastructure, while software does not. That qualification is important. Nolan is not using history as a motivational poster for tech ethics. He is interested in the recurring structure. A group becomes capable of building something before institutions become capable of governing it. We often imagine intelligence and morality scale together. Nolan's films do not. The smarter and more capable a system becomes, the farther its consequences can travel. But increasing agency does not automatically give the people operating it more wisdom, restraint, or willingness to remain accountable once the outcome has moved beyond their original intention. Oppenheimer's tragedy is not that he failed to think, but that thinking became extremely specialized. Solve the physics now, win the war now, negotiate control later, and by the time every local task has succeeded, the global system has changed in a way nobody involved can properly reverse. The other thing I realized is that for all the isolated men in Nolan's films, his worldview is not simply individualistic. He has said that modern culture overstates the virtue of individuality, and Dunkirk is his clearest rebuttal. No single hero completes the evacuation. Survival emerges from pilots, naval officers, frightened soldiers, civilian sailors, medics, and people who never understand the entire operation. The little ships matter because ordinary people enter a system larger than themselves without being promised control. The same pattern is hidden inside Nolan's supposedly solitary geniuses. Cobb needs an architect, forger, chemist, point man, and client. Batman needs Alfred, Lucius Gordon, Rachel Dent, and a city capable of choosing something better than the Joker predicts. Cooper needs Brand, Tars, Murph, generations of researchers, and future humans. Oppenheimer needs a town of scientists, soldiers, workers, and families. Even the protagonist in Tenet is saved by a friendship whose full history he does not yet know. The protagonist naturally receives the close-up, so it is easy to leave a Nolan film remembering one exceptional man, even though the outcome usually depended on a network of people who never possessed the whole plan and still chose to do their small part. This also explains Nolan's faith in the audience, and he grew up with silent Super 8 cartridges, learning to place one image after another before sophisticated dialogue entered the process. He talks about cinema as an extremely powerful communicator if the filmmaker chooses the right images, sound, rhythm, and perspective. But communication is not transmission of a locked answer, and the audience completes the work. Nolan layers films so they function during a first viewing while holding narrative density for later ones. He knows contemporary viewers pause, rewatch, and compare, and he refuses to explain endings because an official answer would reduce the audience's participation. By the release of The Odyssey, he was still saying, a film goes into the world and the audience tells the filmmaker what it is. This sounds paradoxical beside his insistence that ambiguity needs a sincere authorial interpretation. I think the two ideas fit. The way I understand the balance is that the filmmaker still has to build something coherent enough to stand, but once people enter it, they need room to move, which is also how Nolan talks about giving Oppenheimer firm narrative payoffs without closing every layer of ambiguity. Or, more simply, the architect has to know how the building stands. That does not determine what every person will feel while walking through it. This also changed how I see Nolan's commitment to film practical effects and large format exhibition, which can sometimes look from the outside like an increasingly expensive technical hobby built around bigger cameras, bigger screens, louder sound, and a polite request that everybody please put the phone away. There is craft pride in it, obviously, but the artistic belief underneath it is that physical scale can create subjective intimacy. With Dunkirk, the format makes the beach and sea overwhelming, while the camera stays tied to limited human positions. With Oppenheimer, IMAX is used not only for New Mexico and Trinity, but for faces. Historical consequence is read in Poor's eyes and tiny shifts of expression. With Interstellar, the size of space makes the family separation feel physically absurd. Nolan's realism works in a similar way, although the popular claim that he simply avoids visual effects is exaggerated, because what he actually prefers is giving actors and cameras something physical to respond to before using whatever other techniques are needed to complete the illusion. The rotating corridor in Inception, real aircraft in Dunkirk, and large-scale practical elements in Trinity are not valuable because real automatically means morally superior. They are valuable because the captured image contains uncontrolled detail, gravity, light resistance, human reaction. Reality contributes information. The filmmaker did not have to simulate one variable at a time. That is a very builder-like instinct. If you can make the system produce the desired behavior honestly, you gain texture for free. The theatrical audience matters for similar reasons. A room full of people becomes part of the instrument. Tension, laughter, silence, and scale are shared even though everyone interprets the film privately. Nolan's whole career sits inside that tension between singular perspective and collective experience. He wants to put us inside one mind, together. And then in 2026, Nolan described The Odyssey as a story he had effectively been telling throughout his career. Family, love, revenge, war, and coming of age inside one foundational text. That makes sense, because Odysseus is almost a prototype Nolan protagonist. He is intelligent, technically resourceful, deceptive, identity-shifting, and very good at escaping local problems. He survives by controlling information, and he tells stories inside stories, and he calls himself nobody. And he wants to return to his wife and son, but his own decisions keep extending the route. Basically, he has all the competence we usually want from a movie hero, but every clever escape keeps adding something to a moral bill that will eventually follow him home. Nolan approached the adaptation by first listing the images he felt an audience expected: the sirens, Cyclops, Trojan horse, before immersing himself in translations. He wanted an earthy, emotionally accessible language rather than artificially elevated speech, and that process says something about his larger method. He respects the foundational text without trying to embalm it, which means his real question is not how to preserve every ancient detail, but which emotional structure can still reach a modern audience without pretending those viewers have arrived from ancient Greece. His largest interpretive change is guilt. Nolan's Odysseus is haunted by the consequences of victory at Troy in a way Homer's hero is not. That choice has been debated by classicists and critics, and it should be, and it imports a modern moral consciousness into an ancient heroic framework. But As a Nolan film, the choice makes complete sense because Odysseus has spent his life solving the immediate problem through another clever deception, only to discover that each solution produces another consequence, until home is no longer just a destination he can reach by being smarter than everybody else. It is the place where he must stop performing intelligence and become accountable to people who experience the cost of his absence. The voyage brings Nolan's different uses of time together without needing to announce the trick, because 20 Years Away is both an epic chronology and a private pressure that turns a child into an adult, a marriage into a memory, and a victorious man into somebody who understands victory differently. Nolan called it a story of middle age and said it would have been a different film had he made it younger, and that admission helps us see the development across his work. If I had to describe the change across his career, the younger protagonist is trying to construct an identity strong enough to master chaos, while the older one has begun asking what that mastery cost, whether it solved the real problem, and if there is still some way to go home. Leonard cannot answer because he resets himself. Bruce survives only by letting Batman end. Cobb gets home when he stops checking the top. Cooper returns after losing the shared time he wanted. Oppenheimer receives recognition but cannot reverse what he released. Odysseus discovers that return is not restoration, and the person who comes home is not the person who left. Nolan's world has grown from noir rooms to dreams, cities, planets, history, and myth. The emotional shape remains remarkably small: a person, a wound, a system built around it, and the eventual arrival of consequence. After putting all of this together, I came back to the original question of how Christopher Nolan actually sees the world, and I do not think there is one perfect sentence that can answer it, but there is a mental model that keeps returning. Based on the films and on what he has actually said, I would compress it like this. The mental model I kept coming back to is that reality exists, but every human being enters it through one narrow point of view. So memory, identity, and even history become constructions that we genuinely need, while remaining far more vulnerable to manipulation than we like admitting. Time matters because it keeps changing what an action means after the person has already committed to it, and intention becomes a consequence. A victory can slowly become guilt, and the decision that felt local in one moment eventually becomes the history somebody else has to live inside. Intelligence helps us build systems, but no system supplies its own moral purpose. So the same competence that rescues somebody in one situation can rationalize obsession in another, and a moral rule only begins to mean something when violating it would genuinely make the immediate problem easier. And because no individual sees the whole map, survival depends on other people: collaborators, families, citizens, strangers in little boats, and audiences willing to complete the meaning of a story. This is why Nolan avoids God shots in Dunkirk, writes Oppenheimer in first person, locks us inside Leonard's broken chronology, and refuses to settle the spinning top because he is less interested in showing reality from nowhere than in making us feel what it costs to act from somewhere. That is also why the films are hopeful, though never casually so. The hope in these films is definitely not that a brilliant man will eventually control everything, because Nolan keeps showing how badly that fantasy fails. It is that limited people can still choose responsibility, cooperation, and some version of home after the performance of control has exhausted itself.